There is a story in the ancient Gnostic texts that was never supposed to exist. Not because it is obscure, not because it is symbolic, but because of what it implies. It is not a story about humanity, not about prophets, not even about salvation. It is about something far more unsettling, a ruler of the system itself that turned against it. And not through rebellion, not through force, but through something much more dangerous, recognition. His name was Sabaoth, and according to a text known as On the Origin of the World, he was not just another figure in the hierarchy. He was an Archon, a ruler, a being whose role was to maintain the structure of reality itself, to enforce it, to stabilize it, to ensure that everything remained exactly as it was. In Gnostic cosmology, the Archons are not seekers. They do not question. They do not evolve. They exist to preserve order. They are the architecture of the system, the invisible forces that shape perception, limit awareness, and define what feels real. And Sabaoth was born inside that system, raised by it, formed by it. He was not outside looking in. He was part of its design, which makes what happened next almost impossible. Because Sabaoth did not simply doubt the system, he did not hesitate. He did not question quietly. He saw something that should not have been visible to him. And in that moment, everything changed. The texts describe it in a way that feels almost too simple. No battle, no confrontation, no dramatic event. Just a moment where he heard something, a voice, not a command, not an order, a voice, the voice of Sophia. In Gnostic tradition, Sophia is not just a figure. She represents something much deeper, not information, not belief, but direct knowing, a form of awareness that does not argue, does not convince, does not force. It reveals. And when Sabaoth heard that voice, he did something no Archon is supposed to do. He recognized it. And that recognition was enough. He did not need proof. He did not need confirmation. He did not analyze it. He did not try to understand it. He simply saw. And in that seeing, the entire structure he belonged to began to lose its authority. The text says something very specific. It says that Sabaoth condemned his father being the demiurge, the creator of the system, the architect of the world of limitation. But this was not an act of rebellion. It was not anger. It was not defiance. It was clarity. Because once something is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. And this is where the story becomes dangerous. Because if a being created by the system, designed to maintain it, fully aligned with it, can suddenly see beyond it, then something about the system is not as closed as it appears, which raises a question that the text never answers directly. Why would an Archon awaken at all? A being born inside the structure, shaped by its rules, defined by its limits. Why would something inside him respond to a higher light? And if that is possible, then the story is no longer just about Sabaoth. It becomes something else, something much closer, because this is where most people misunderstand these texts. They read them as mythology, as ancient cosmology, as symbolic stories about distant forces. But the Gnostics were not describing a universe far away. They were describing patterns, structures, mechanisms of perception itself, which means the story of Sabaoth may not be about an Archon at all. It may be about something within you, something that has always been part of the system, something that maintains it, something that reacts, interprets, and reinforces the same patterns every day. And yet, something that is still capable of seeing beyond it, not through effort, not through struggle, but through recognition. And if that is true, then this story is not ancient. It is immediate, because the question is no longer, why did Sabaoth awaken? The real question is, what inside a system allows something to suddenly see beyond it? And more importantly, what happens after that moment? To understand why this moment matters, you have to see the structure Sabaoth was part of. Because in the Gnostic texts, the world is not described the way we usually imagine it. It is not just physical, it is not just material. It is layered, organized, structured through levels of perception. The texts speak of rulers, domains, and invisible authorities, not as mythological beings floating somewhere in the sky, but as organizing principles, forces that shape how reality appears, how it is interpreted, how it is experienced. They called these forces Archons. The word itself simply means rulers, but not rulers in the political sense, rulers in the structural sense. They govern perception, they define limits, they create the boundaries of what feels possible. And above them, or rather, at the origin of this structure, stands a figure known as the Demiurge, not as an evil god in the simplistic sense, but as a creator whose awareness is incomplete, a being that generates a world without fully seeing beyond it, which means everything that emerges from him inherits that limitation, including the Archons, including Sabaoth. This is why the system is so stable, because it is self-consistent. Everything inside it reinforces everything else. Thought reinforces perception. Perception reinforces identity. Identity reinforces behavior. And behavior reinforces the structure again, a closed loop. A system that does not need to trap you because it defines the way you see. And if perception itself is structured, then everything that appears within it feels natural, obvious, real. This is why the Gnostics did not describe the system as a prison with walls. They described it as something far more subtle, a prison of interpretation, where nothing needs to force you, because everything already makes sense from within it. And this is where the story of Sabaoth becomes so unusual, because he was not outside this structure, he was one of its supports, one of the forces maintaining it. Imagine that for a moment. A system so complete that even its rulers do not question it, not because they are controlled, but because nothing in their perception suggests anything beyond it exists, until something appears that does not fit, not as a contradiction, not as an argument, but as a presence. The Gnostic texts describe Sophia in this way, not as an invader, not as an opponent, but as illumination. She does not break the system. She reveals something the system cannot account for. And that is far more destabilizing, because a system can defend itself against attack, but it cannot defend itself against clarity. And when that clarity appears, it does not need to explain anything. It does not need to convince. It simply shows. And what it shows is enough. This is why Sabaoth does not fight. He does not resist. He does not struggle. He sees. And in that moment, the structure he was part of begins to reorganize, not collapse instantly, not disappear, but lose its absolute authority. And this detail is critical, because most people imagine awakening as something dramatic, a complete break, a sudden transformation. But the Gnostic texts describe something much quieter, much more precise. The structure remains, the world remains, the roles remain, but the relationship to them changes, and once that relationship shifts, everything begins to move differently. The text says that after Sabaoth recognized the higher light, Sophia did something unexpected. She did not destroy him. She did not remove him from the system. She elevated him, placed him above the chaos he once governed, gave him a position in what is described as the seventh heaven. But this is not a reward, it is not a promotion, it is a repositioning. Because the seventh position in ancient symbolism is not the highest in power. It is the threshold, the point where a cycle completes and something begins to turn. And from that position, Sabaoth becomes something very different. Not a ruler enforcing the system, but a guardian at the edge of it. A presence that no longer maintains the structure blindly, but observes it, sees it, understands its movement. And this is where the story deepens, because the text does not present this as a final state. It presents it as a beginning that introduces a tension, a new dynamic, because the moment something sees beyond the system does not simply disappear. Something else emerges, something that ensures that recognition does not stabilize easily. And this is where the structure reveals something even more precise. Because beneath the position of Sabaoth, another force appears. Not above him, not opposing him directly, but just below, almost invisible. A force that does not attack, does not confront, does not argue. It does something far more effective. It makes you forget. And this is where the story shifts again, from cosmology into something much closer to experience. Because what the Gnostics are describing here is not just a structure in the heavens. It is a mechanism, a pattern, one that begins to appear the moment something in you starts to see clearly. And what happens next is not what most people expect. What happens next in the story is easy to overlook because nothing dramatic appears on the surface. No battle, no collapse, no visible conflict. And yet, this is where everything becomes real. Because the moment Sabaoth recognizes the higher light, something else is introduced into the structure, not as an enemy, not as a punishment, but as a counterbalance. The texts describe it in a very specific way. They speak of a domain placed beneath him, a region associated with death. But not death in the physical sense, not the end of the body, something far more subtle. The loss of recognition, forgetting, a force that does not destroy awareness, but slowly pulls it back into familiarity, back into patterns, back into what feels known. And this is where the story stops being distant, because this is not something happening in a distant heaven. You can observe this directly. Think about a moment where you saw something clearly, a pattern in your life, a behavior, a reaction, something that, for a brief moment, felt completely obvious. You didn't need to analyze it. You didn't need to explain it. You just saw it. And in that moment, there was a sense of distance, almost as if you were no longer inside the pattern, but looking at it. That is recognition. That is the moment the structure loosens. But now, notice what happens next. Not hours later, not days later, almost immediately, something begins to move. A thought appears, a justification, a distraction, a subtle shift of attention, and without realizing it, you're back inside the same pattern. Not because you chose to go back, not because you failed, but because something pulled you back into identification. This is what the Gnostics were pointing to. Not a force that attacks you, but a force that absorbs you. And it does so quietly, without resistance, without conflict. It does not argue with recognition. It waits. It lets the clarity fade. It allows the mind to begin moving again, to interpret, to label, to explain. And the moment that happens, the distance disappears. You are no longer observing the pattern. You are the pattern again. This is why the story introduces this domain beneath Sabaoth, because recognition alone is not stable. It appears, and then something tries to dissolve it, not through opposition, but through familiarity. And this is where most people misunderstand awakening. They think it is about reaching a state, holding on to clarity, maintaining awareness, but that effort is already part of the system, because the moment you try to hold the experience, you are moving again. You are doing something with it. And that movement pulls you back. The Gnostics described this with unsettling precision. They did not say the system keeps you trapped through ignorance. They said it keeps you trapped through participation, through the constant movement of the mind, the need to respond, to interpret, to do something. So what you begin to notice is not a lack of awareness, but a constant return to activity, even after seeing, even after recognizing, even after understanding. Something keeps restarting the movement, and that movement is what sustains the structure. This is why the story places Sabaoth above this domain, not because he escaped it completely, but because he can now see it, observe it, without immediately falling into it. And this detail is critical because it changes everything. Freedom is not described as leaving the system. It is described as no longer being fully absorbed by it, not being pulled automatically, not reacting instantly, not identifying with every movement that appears. And this is where another figure enters the story, one that is often overlooked. Her name is Zoe, which simply means life. The texts describe her as being placed beside Sabaoth, not as a companion, but as a guide, a presence that keeps his orientation towards something beyond the system. Because recognition alone is not enough. It opens the possibility, but something else must stabilize it, not effort, not control, but a different kind of attention, one that does not interfere, one that does not try to change what it sees, one that simply remains. And this is where the story becomes extremely precise, because it is no longer describing mythology. It is describing a mechanism, a process that you can observe directly, right now, every time something arises in your experience. There is a brief moment, a fraction of a second, where awareness sees it before reacting to it. And in that moment, you are not inside the pattern. You are above it, just like Sabaoth. But that moment is unstable, because almost instantly, the reflex appears to think, to respond, to interpret. And the moment you follow that reflex, you descend again, back into the structure, back into the loop, back into the same movement. And this happens so quickly that most people never notice it. They only notice the result, the repetition, the feeling that nothing changes. But the mechanism is here, in this transition, between seeing and reacting, between awareness and movement. And once you begin to notice that, the story of Sabaoth stops being symbolic, because you realize this is not about an Archon in a distant heaven. It is about a position within your own perception, one that appears briefly, again and again, every day. The question is not whether it exists. The question is whether it can remain without being pulled back into the system. And that is where everything begins to change. At this point, the story is no longer about Sabaoth. Not really. Because nothing in this narrative was meant to stay external. It was never just about an Archon, or a distant heaven, or a cosmic structure far removed from your life. It was about something much closer, something you experience but rarely notice. Because the real turning point in this story was not when Sabaoth heard the voice. It was not when he was elevated. It was not even when the structure began to lose its authority. The real turning point was the moment he did not move, the moment recognition appeared and was not immediately turned into action. That is the detail most people miss, because everything you have been taught pushes you to respond, to fix, to interpret, to do something with what you see. But the Gnostic texts point in a completely different direction. They describe a form of clarity that does not lead to effort, that does not create movement, that does not turn into a new identity. It simply remains. And that is what changes everything. Because the system, whatever you want to call it, does not depend on your ignorance. It depends on your participation, on the constant movement of thought, on the need to react, to interpret, to become. As long as that movement continues, the structure remains stable, not because it is forcing you, but because it is being sustained, quietly, continuously, by the way attention moves. This is why the story never describes Sabaoth escaping the system completely. He does not disappear. He does not abandon his position. He remains at the threshold, a place where both things are visible, the structure and what lies beyond it. And from that position, something very subtle happens. Life continues. The world does not vanish. Situations still arise. Decisions still happen. But the relationship to them is no longer the same, because the urgency is gone. The pressure to react fades. The need to constantly interfere begins to dissolve. And without that pressure, something unexpected appears. Simplicity, not as an idea, not as a goal, but as a natural state, where experience unfolds without being constantly managed. And this is where most people turn back, because this simplicity does not feel dramatic. It does not feel like an achievement. It does not feel like progress. In fact, it can feel almost like nothing. And the mind rejects that. It says, this can't be it. There must be something more. I need to go further. And in that movement, the system quietly restores itself. Because the search begins again, the effort returns, the loop continues. This is why the ancient texts were never popular. Because they do not offer improvement. They do not promise transformation. They do not give you something to do. They remove the need to do anything. And that is deeply unsettling, because it leaves nothing for the mind to hold on to, nothing to control, nothing to become, only something to notice. That the structure does not collapse through effort. It collapses when it is no longer being maintained. And that does not require force. It does not require discipline. It begins with something much smaller, much quieter. The moment you see and do not immediately move, even for a second, even briefly, that is enough. Because in that moment, you are no longer inside the system. You are at the threshold, exactly where Sabaoth was placed. Not outside, not escaping, but no longer fully absorbed. And from there, something begins to change, not dramatically, not all at once, but in a way that cannot be reversed, because once a pattern is seen clearly and not immediately reinforced, it begins to lose its strength, not through resistance, through irrelevance. And that is the part most people never reach, not because it is hidden, but because it is too simple, too quiet, too close. So we return to the question that started this story. Why would an Archon awaken? Why would a being designed to maintain the system suddenly turn against it? The answer was never rebellion. It was never force. It was recognition, the moment something sees clearly, without immediately becoming what it sees. And if that is possible for something born inside the structure, then it is possible here. Not as a belief, not as a theory, but as something you can observe directly, right now, because the threshold is not somewhere far away. It is not in another realm. It is not at the end of a path. It is the moment you stop interfering with what you already see. And if you stay there, even briefly, you may begin to notice something unexpected, not something new, something that was always there, waiting for the movement to stop. So the question is no longer what you need to do. The question is, what happens if, for a moment, you don't?